welcome in Mark, the host of the Bible Paladin YouTube channel, to Forever Forward.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me on. I just love what you're doing with this channel. Just taking ordinary people, which I say that, but I think once you hear their stories, you realize no one's ordinary.
I think that's the goal.
Yeah.
That's the goal, at least. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think the feeling is very mutual. I actually, for those listening, found Mark's channel during a random browse of YouTube. And it happened to be during a time where I was kind of beginning my journey in faith. And in this case, in Christianity. So for context here, and Mark, maybe you can give some context as far as what are the types of videos that you're making on your channel?
Thanks. The channel really began with just me wanting to go through the Bible, read it with the audience and do a commentary, kind of have a virtual Bible study. And so, I just started with Genesis and started going through with it, reading a little bit each time, talking about how it inspires me, but also trying to look at it from a historical point of view, using current scholarship, what it looks like, and then saying, is it still relevant? How do we make sense of those stories?
Well, it's funny because for me, for a long time, I think I had fallen away from my faith. And I think the major reason is because I wasn't able to connect the words in that book to my life. And when I came across your channel, not only did you go through, for example, I watched all your videos on Genesis, but you connected them to these contemporary values that are super relevant to the world today. I guess on that vein, why is this stuff relevant at all? Why do you think that we need the Bible to help guide us or provide some type of framework for us to live within?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, at first, a lot of times when people think of Bible, they just think about, it's just a Christian thing, or if they're looking at the New or the Old Testament, it's just a Jewish thing, what is it about? And for me, the core of it is it's a collection of stories.
Right.
It's a collection of stories that have been around now for millennia, and people share them. And of course, a lot of people believe it is the inspired word of God. And a lot of people kind of look at kind of from maybe a historical point of view, a literature point of view, whatever it is. And for me, as a person of faith, I do see it as the word of God, but I also see it as, stories that were told by people that maybe seem, if they lived 1,000 years ago, so different from us, 2,000, 4,000 years ago. And yet at the same time, they were dealing with the same issues that we deal with today. The same situation. And the Bible, the stories that are in there was just a way for them to kind of make sense of those stories, to make sense of their lives and connect it to something that was greater than themselves. And I think for so many people, that's that sense of spirituality, which, is different for me than even the idea of religion. I think as human beings, we have a spiritual component to us, right? And just like we've got our intellectual component, psychological, emotional, social, all of that, there's something spiritual about us as well that we want to connect to something bigger than ourselves. And I think the Bible, at least for myself, it can help us to enter into that, a different world about what that looks like and kind of make it something that makes sense.
It's so funny you say humans have this natural yearning to want to connect to something greater than themselves. I know I personally do. But for the longest time, my disconnect was relating back to, whatever that higher power might be. But as you've done so well on your channel, it's so true that these people and these stories that are written about, they're just like us. And they're trying to figure out their own lives. They have their own issues of jealousy and all different types of things. And I think what you've done really well is make these people seem not so different than us. Do you ever find it difficult to abstract out some of those concepts? Or do you find that when you read the Bible, it actually pairs fairly well with modern society?
No, I do find it difficult, actually. And part of this project for me, it's also a spiritual journey for me. It's an opportunity for me to get back into the Bible. I studied it a lot in my youth and, as an adult, and looking through it, going back and saying, how do I continue to make it relevant? How do I continue to look into it? And sometimes it's very difficult. And I think that's one of the reasons, I just finished Genesis. I'm going to be moving to the New Testament. And I think we can get stuck sometimes, at least I get stuck. If I just kind of read the Bible, somebody, I'm going to read the Bible, I'm just going to start from page 1 and go through it. You get to like Numbers or Leviticus or Deuteronomy, and it's just like, oh my gosh, what is this about? Where
what
are
is
we
this
going
even
with
saying?
this? And all these laws and everything else. And so it can be really difficult. And I think that's where I like finding those nuggets and those stories within the Bible and trying to connect it all, and not just, it's easy to take a verse here or a story here or this chapter, which happens, I think, for so many people, that belong to organized religion is you hear a sermon on this particular passage, And my question is, well, how does it relate to the rest of that chapter, that book, that whole story of what it looks like? And so yeah, I think that's a big challenge, is kind of finding the meaning within it. And that's one of the reasons I like to think about how it connects to modern stories. We continue to, honestly, I think, tell the same stories generation after generation. There's just
I
different
agree. I
characters,
completely agree.
in them,
Right.
different settings.
And it's funny too, like in my own reading, and look, I'm not even all the way through the Bible. I'm about halfway through, and I'm reading it very slowly because it's a fairly challenging book to read. I think it puts some people off, just given that sometimes you get a few pages into a chapter and you're like, what does that even mean? What did I even just read?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm slowly, piece by piece, and with the help of your videos, getting through it. But I think as I abstract out kind of the main elements of each of these stories, I start to sort of see myself in the characters of the Bible, if that makes sense, and almost imagining myself as these individuals that deal with the same problems that I'm dealing with has actually been very powerful.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is part of the power of that. Part of the power of what is coming through the scriptures is that, and it's such a big, I even hesitate to call it a book, because the Bible is so many books, in so many different points of view, different genres. And I think that's an exciting time too, because, with going through Genesis, of course, these are narrative stories. They're about family, they're about individuals, but like you get to like the Psalms or something, which is poetry, and how do we connect to that? But I think we connect to that in the same way we might connect to music. Maybe there's a powerful song, that it speaks to you in a certain way. And that's why we have, I think, these different genres in the Bible, because different things will connect to different people.
And do you think that individuals have to be quote unquote religious to connect with the Bible? And if not, why is it important that we keep, the non-religious folks in mind when we, read something like this?
Yeah, they answer the first question. I think I don't think it's necessary to be religious, to kind of get into the Bible, and even to make a distinction between, I think sometimes we talk about religion and spirituality, and what the two are. Religion is where I think it allows individuals who have a like spirituality, a similar belief system, to come together, to keep each other accountable, right? To ritualize, their beliefs, and to praise together and worship together. And I think that, definitely has a place, but some people have been burned by religion too. I think religion, has had a way historically too of kind of becoming exclusive, becoming an us versus them, kind of building up a little bit too many boundaries sometimes that kind of confuses people. And so, in fact, that's one of the reasons why I've tried to keep my channel, a little bit more like, let's look at the stories of the Bible. There's some very successful channels that's all about debates between, different factions within Christianity, and who's right and who's wrong, and all of this
Absolutely.
stuff. And I kind of wanted to try something different. And maybe it's, David, that's not what people want. People seem to like the debates. People seem to like
Well,
let's argue about this kind of thing.
What I appreciate is that you often raise questions like, hey, was this character justified in what he did? Like, yes or no. You're not here to present an opinion or an argument. I think you're more so here to open the discussion in an objective way. And I do think your channel is quite unique in that, look, what's most viral is what's most controversial. So to your point, there are a lot of channels out there that want to argue about what's right and what's wrong. Whereas I think you're taking a different approach, which is here's what it is. And let's talk about maybe how it's relatable. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, thanks. And part of it, talking about, being able to even engage the Bible if you're not religious, I think is something that, there's a reason I think that it's been around for so long. Yes, because churches have promoted it. Yes, because, it's been there. But I think people do still find resonance, within it and what it looks like. I'm going to let you on a little secret. We talk about, and I'm probably going to get some slack for this from, even from my viewers. We talk about, the Bible being God's word, right? Which I believe. But I also think that all of the stories that we tell are God's word. When you're interviewing someone on a podcast and you're asking them questions and you're finding about their life story and what they went through, that's their experience of God in their life. Whether or not they're going to define it that way or talk about it that way, that is, where their life has gone and where it's been. And once we reflect on that, we might realize, okay, there was some sort of plan here. There was some sort of destination, that I was going through. And, maybe I failed, maybe I had some setbacks, but eventually, I'm going to make sense of these things and make it work. And I think, for me, me, being able to connect these stories is something because they're timeless, right? And they're timeless. And that's why so many, myths and tales and, movies, that we have today, you can go back and say, and sometimes people will say, well, that movie, I felt there was a lot of Christian themes in that, even like The Matrix, for example. And you can say that. I say, yeah, but whether or not it was intentional, I don't know. Maybe it was, or maybe it's just the fact that these are stories that have been around forever and we just keep retelling them because they make sense.
If you abstract out those themes, I believe that kind of makes up the framework of what it means to be human, in my opinion. So whether you call it Christian or you just call it life or whatever, I believe that there are fundamental truths that exist in there. Aside from the faith, aside from the religion, I do believe that there are some of the truest truths about what it means to be us in that book. And, one thing that you said that I thought was really interesting was you said, look, when we have even conversations like this, in a way, that's God. And I have found since I started this podcast, the times where I feel most present and most alive are during conversations like this. Mm-hmm. And in a way, when I have these types of conversations, I feel this intangible sense that there's a presence out there that is moving with me in the world and is moving with me for good. And so for me, maybe God is the push that I've been given to move my life towards righteous ideals. And so, I think God means a lot to a lot of people. And I think sometimes people get tripped up that, God is just this guy in the sky watching us. And what I've learned through your videos and reading some of my own, passages in the Bible is that maybe God is not that. And God is actually a lot more.
Yeah, well, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, for me, that's definitely what it's about. It's finding those moments, and you can feel God's presence, in those conversations.
It's like in these conversations, I feel closest to God. And it's funny because that's the only way I can articulate it. And it's like, there's something about me maybe aligning my interests and feeling like I'm doing something that's net positive for the world. But there's something about me taking this leap of faith that for once in my life makes me feel like I'm moving in the way that he wants me to. And it's not like I'm excited or I'm energized or I'm passionate. It's like there's something more to it. And maybe that's what having faith is all about.
At least the beginning, right? And maybe that's what keeps you going, and that's, where you're at
right.
and experiencing that. I think for myself, if you're not able to feel that, the faith, what does it mean, right? How do you connect it to reality? How do you connect it to relationships? And what does that look like? And so I think it's having that experience of faith, which is different than just kind of an intellectual knowledge, or belief, but how does
Absolutely.
it make sense in your life?
Absolutely. So maybe if we could talk about the text specifically. I mean, you've covered several different stories of the Bible on your channel. Yeah. Do you have one passage or one section of the Bible that you particularly like or think is particularly relevant or really should be brought to light in this context?
There's a lot of different texts that I've been inspired by, throughout my life. And I think that's something that's really kind of kept me going. And there's one, particularly, it's from the New Testament, from Matthew's Gospel. And it's interesting. I don't hear it brought up as much as I would have thought that I would by a lot of Christians. And I think there's some reasons why, because it really is a challenging one. And it's typically called like the Last Judgment or the sheep and the goats. You may be familiar with this, where Jesus says at the end of time, it's going to be like this. It's like a shepherd dividing up his sheep and goats, and he puts the sheep on the right, the goats on the left.
I've never read this, so now I'm curious.
Okay.
Please go on.
It's from Matthew. I wasn't brought in a family that we like memorized chapter verse kind of a thing. And so it's just, I know the stories, but I really have to look it up if I want to tell you, okay, it's this chapter, this, so it's Matthew 25.
Yeah.
But Jesus, was talking about the judgment basically. And he says, he's going to say to the ones on the right, when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me water. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison or sick, you visited me. And you guys come to the kingdom, come to the paradise. I'm paraphrasing, of course, that's been prepared for you since the beginning of time. And they basically look at him and say, well, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or naked or in prison or ill and help you? He said, well, whenever you did that to any of the least of my brethren, you did it for me. Yeah, and then he turns to the ones on the other side and says, you guys, I was hungry, you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, you didn't give me drink. And he goes down the list, and they said, well, when did we see you hungry and not feed you? When did we see you in prison and not visit you? So when you didn't do that for somebody, you didn't do that for me. And you go to the fires prepared for you. But for
Oh,
me,
that gave me chills because I know exactly what that's getting at.
yeah, and for me, that's such a powerful statement because it's kind of what we're talking about before. Jesus isn't talking about an intellectual belief. He's saying, you guys think you know who I am. This God, this praise, this worship. He said, but this is kind of the ground of what it's all about. Are you caring for fellow human beings? Are you caring
Right.
for the other people in this world, or are you just passing them by? And it's kind of that net positive you're talking about. Can I go through life and can I see suffering? Can I see people who are struggling, who are having difficulties, and do I respond? And for us, it may be different than it was in Jesus' time. People maybe in their minds thinking, okay, he's talking about the lepers. He's talking about those people begging on the side of the road. He's talking about those Samaritans that I don't like, whatever it is. For today, okay, maybe, he's talking about the homeless guy, that's asking for a handout, someone who's dealing with behavioral or mental health issues that, people are getting ostracized for something. How do we treat those individuals that are really struggling in some way? Because I think it's different for every generation. And what does that look like? And for me, that was a real challenge because I was brought up in a very faith-filled family, and we went to church all the time, and it was just part of who we were. And really, I think in hearing this passage, it kind of goes beyond, what you do on Sundays, going to church.
Well, it's funny because I think a lot of people think that going to church on Sundays is all they got to do. And I'm going to be honest, I don't even go to church every Sunday. I probably should, but I actually maybe naively consider myself to be equally faithful to some individuals that go to church every Sunday. Mm-hmm. And I'm learning over time that just because you go sit, in the pew doesn't necessarily mean that you are living a Christ-like existence. And this passage would certainly speak to exactly that, living a life, worthy of Jesus is more than just praising him. It's living like him.
Yeah. And I think for me, that's kind of a core element, of what it means to, as you say, live, in such a faith-filled life. What does it mean to follow Christ?
You touched a little bit about your upbringing, and this is kind of off script, but I am just curious. Like you said, you were raised in a faithful household. Yeah. At what age do you start to really connect to the scripture? Was it from a young age, or was there a moment where you were like, hey, I really want to dive into this at a deeper level?
Yeah, it's kind of been as long as I can remember. I think I've been very blessed. I want to say that I know people from all sorts of different households, but I think I was very blessed, and that it was just part of who I was. Where I was raised Roman Catholic family. We went to church very regularly, but it wasn't, I know there's stereotypes about, Catholics don't read the Bible kind of thing, versus, certain, more Bible-based Protestant denominations, that sort of thing. But we did in our household, and it was always kind of part of our prayer life, and it was part of who we were. And for me, it was really, I think when it kind of hit was, I was like second grade, second or third, and I remember because, that was the time of my first communion, right? And I really wanted to understand what this was about. Because I learned about that in my religion class and all the facts about it and what we believed about communion and Eucharist and that. But it was still like, what does it really mean? What does this mean for my life? This is supposed to change me. How's it going to change me? Am I going to feel differently afterwards? And kind of getting into that. And I think just really beginning to dive into those stories in the Bible and seeing how it is. I mean, you talk about sometimes you put yourself into the stories, maybe,
exactly.
that's like me, how would have I reacted? What would have that been? And kind of thinking about, what would have been like to be at that time? Who was Jesus and what was he like? And having those conversations. And it went from not just reading the Bible, or going to church, but having a relationship with the Lord, and I think for me, that's the core of it. And the Bible helps me understand that because through that, I can see, well, who was the Lord, in order to have a relationship, with this person.
You want some context.
Yeah, I want some context.
Want to have a relationship.
And I remember something my parents had told me, is to, when we talk about prayer, having a conversation, with the Lord, what does that feel like? And so I would imagine him as being the same age that I was.
Really?
Yeah. And I mean, because we have these stories of, when he was born. We have stories of him when he was 12 years old, kind of getting lost in the temple.
Yeah.
We have stories, and then suddenly he's like 30. It's like, okay, what was, how was he as a teenager?
Yeah.
How was he, as a 8-year-old? And so in my imagination, I would kind of like have these conversations as if we were the same age, and kind of ask, how's school? What'd you learn
And
today?
but
What was that
was
like?
that comforting for you to almost feel like you were talking with with a peer in a way?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that
Yeah.
really it made that relationship more real for me, and
Yeah.
not just having like these snapshots, of Jesus, or kind of these images that we have, or these moments of life, but as a real human being, what was his experience of life? What did that look like? And how can
Yeah.
relate, and it was very comforting, and I still do that. I think even now in my life, trying to have these conversations. Yeah, so I think the more that I read the scriptures, it gives me that context again. Who
Yeah.
is this person that I want to be a friend with? Of course, Lord, Savior, Judge, all of those things, but friend too.
Right. And because I think he can be all of those things.
I think so.
And one thing that I've actually tried to do, and this has been really interesting thought experiment for me, is as I read the Bible, I've tried to put myself into the shoes of the antagonist of the
Oh, okay,
stories
yeah,
and try and empathize. For example, like in the Cain and Abel story, hey, I can be a pretty jealous guy. I might have done what Cain did, or in the story of Noah's Ark, like maybe I would have been one of the ones that was washed away in the flood. I think it's actually really interesting, and I think it's actually necessary for us to not only imagine ourselves as the hero, but also through these stories, hey, maybe we would have been the ones that weren't so
yeah.
holy at the time. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, because for me, that's been a really interesting way to actually read the Bible, but actually consider it in a different way.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's a way that is so helpful too, is to kind of put ourselves in the different shoes of these different individuals and what that looks like.
Yeah.
Because there's a great book called The Prodigal Son by Henry Nouwen, and he's basically observing actually Rembrandt's painting of the prodigal son. And there's a number of figures from the story. And if you're not familiar with the story, there's the father, there's the son who leaves and comes back, and there's the older brother. And he goes through each character and kind of does almost like a personality thing about them, and then kind of puts himself in the shoes of each character. It's exactly what you're saying.
Interesting. Okay.
How would have the father reacted throughout this story? How would have the older brother reacted, about seeing what his younger brother did, and still being
Totally.
welcomed home, after spending all his money and inheritance and everything, and this kind of thing. And so what you're saying is, I mean, it's part of the tradition, of a way of looking at scriptures and being able to really enter into those stories and find that. And even, a lot of the stories in which there may be kind of a hero, today we might even call him an anti-hero, the heroes aren't
Right.
always that great. I mean, the heroes make a lot of mistakes. And
That
yet,
is so
and
true.
yet God keeps saying, no, I still want you. I'm calling you to do something important. And the hero's just like, yeah, well, I got to do this first. Or, I still got to take care
Yeah.
of these issues, or, I got to beat up my brother, whatever it is. And God's like,
Yeah.
whoa, I'm trying to get you a message here. And the main, the protagonist is the one that's like all over the place. And I think that's inspiring too. That's comforting, and knowing that, I keep failing, and yet God's still like, I'm still calling you to do something.
I couldn't agree more. It's like, one issue that I have is with, how do I put this? My own self-doubt, right? I've
Mm-hmm.
been my biggest critic for
Yeah.
my whole life. And for the longest time when I wasn't faithful, it was a little bit lonely, I'll say. When I would beat myself up over, my failures or my perceived failures, it felt like there was nobody to catch me when I fell.
Mm-hmm.
But this new idea that like there is a force out there that wants me to succeed, that forgives me when I fail, as long as I recognize the failure and repent for it, is a very powerful new shift that I've had. And similar to how you were saying in the Bible, look, there's a lot of characters in the Bible that stumble and fall and do things that maybe aren't so righteous, that ultimately receive God's grace because they know that in the end they need to, put their faith in Him and change their ways. So like, for me, as somebody who's been very hard on myself, and I think a lot of people are really hard on themselves, this idea that, Jesus Christ and God is here for me, it's so freeing, and it takes some of the pressure off me. But also, kind of flip to the other side of the coin, it almost makes me feel like I want to make him proud. I want to show whatever's out there that I'm grateful for what I've given. And as a result, I don't want to fail. I want to succeed. Or at least when I fail, I want to get up again. And so
Right.
it doesn't give me the right to be complacent. It doesn't give me the right to do nothing and be like, oh, it's fine. He doesn't care. It's more like, wow, he will forgive me if I fail, but I better succeed because look at how lucky I have it. Look at how blessed I am. Like, that's pretty cool. I have no other way to put it other than like, hey, that's really cool.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
couldn't agree more. I think the way you put it makes a lot of sense. There's that sense of faith. It's a gift. It's something, that God gives us. And then it's kind of just our response. Like, yeah, I want to respond to this in the best way that I can, you know?
I
Um,
do.
so
So
yeah,
one area that maybe we might touch on is we talked a little bit about certain characters in the Bible, maybe not always behaving in the
yeah,
most righteous of ways. I know there are some passages, let's say, in the Bible that are pulled out and excerpts that maybe are a bit controversial. How do you reckon with some of those more controversial sections when you try to abstract them out to positive lessons about,
yeah.
living in today's world? And do you believe that some of those criticisms are actually warranted?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a couple of ways of looking at this. One is sometimes there's a confusion between, the idea of the Bible being descriptive versus prescriptive. What I mean by that is sometimes there's stories that are just told at face value. This is what the people did. This is how they understood what they were doing, and this is what it was. And there's no judgment about that behavior. It's just kind of a description. This is a family history. And this is some of the, horrible things the family did, and just going through
Because
that.
guess what? Like we in our own lives, like I got some horrible stuff that's gone on in
Yeah.
my life, and I've done horrible stuff. That's
And
just the
so, because
truth.
I've heard the same thing, and even in comments, people are like, well, God seems to be okay, with rape and incest and, this
Right.
and that and do that. It's like, well, it doesn't say that he's okay with it. It's just, this is what was going on by these people, and that's why I say descriptive. And then there's other parts of it that are prescriptive in the sense of, well, this is how we're supposed to act. This is what life should look like, and we get into that. So I think that's one kind of misconception where people will take out a verse and say, oh my gosh, they were doing this. It's like, well, yeah, they did do that. It wasn't a good thing. We all agree that it wasn't a good thing. However, there are other parts where I think it's important to realize the cultural context in which the Bible was written, and the different time period. And I mean, one of the biggest things, is even that they didn't seem to have a big issue with the idea of slavery, and what that looked like. A lot of the
That's one of the
patriarchs,
most common criticisms,
right?
I think, of it.
And slavery has been an issue historically throughout the world since as long as history has been written, and unfortunately, even today, it still exists, in different parts of the world. And so, no one, well, say no one, most people would say that it's not a good thing, right?
Yeah,
Okay,
fair. Right.
and we'd agree on that. That we don't want to do that. But there was a time, and it was just kind of part of the reality of life. It wasn't something people typically questioned. And so I think there are passages like that where it's a sense of, what was the context of their writing, what was their understanding of it, and yeah, and I think there's a warrant to say, well, are we supposed to follow that? Well, no. There are parts of it where the people had a different understanding of how people were treated. And even in the passages that do talk about it, typically when slavery is talked about, it's not condemned, but it's also basically you need to treat them well, kind of a thing. Now, I mean, that's obviously not the best answer. You shouldn't have them in the first place.
Of
But it
course.
was kind of like, well, since it is an institution, it's part of our society, it's part of our culture. This is how we should treat, those individuals, and freedom and, and this kind of thing like that. And so I think there are certainly a number of passages that are definitely, told from a cultural perspective that I think is important to realize, when reading the Bible. And, a lot of people have different ways, within different traditions, different ways of understanding, different faith traditions, kind of understand the Bible differently. And as you've probably seen by watching my channel, I'm not a literalist, where it's like,
Yeah.
there's no error, there's no contradiction, there's no repetition, in these stories. I believe these were written by individuals over time, and they pulled from different stories, and there's truth, definitely. And I believe it's inspired, and it's inspired truth, but it also reflects the human condition, and what was going on in that period of time. And they didn't have some of the same insights that we do today, and how to reconcile some of those things. And so I think, there's definitely different ways in which people approach the scriptures, and I'm not, judging, one way or another, because, some, faith traditions are very much, see it in different ways. But I think it's easy then, if you can't see kind of that cultural element, I think it is very easy to say, well, so it's okay, so I mean,
Exactly.
was God, really, okay with this kind of behavior or that kind of behavior, and how do we reconcile that? And sometimes there's not a real easy answer. And I think that for me, that's where kind of that discernment comes in. That's where that prayer comes in. That's where context comes in, and being able to do that.
Yeah, I think that word context is really important. I mean, especially in 2024,
Yeah.
because I think people want to pick out clips and pick out one-liners. And I think one of the things I've learned when I've been reading the Bible is everything must be taken in context, especially something like the Bible, because you can find negatives. If you took, I don't know, all my text messages from the last 27 years and took, one line from it, I'm sure you could find some stuff that you could spin in a negative way. But I think the challenge some people have nowadays is it's much easier to take things in bite size. And it's much harder to put some nuance and thought into reading, the full context around something. So I think when people read the Bible, it's important to remember that there's more to this than the one line that you might see posted on your Instagram feed.
Definitely.
So I think maybe, Mark, if you don't mind, we could just close on where your channel is headed. So obviously you've been through Genesis, and it's funny. I've also watched another famous series on Genesis from Jordan Peterson, who I think is good. Some of his stuff I agree with, some of his stuff I don't, but by and large, I think it's helping me to learn a little bit more. And it's funny. I find your content to be of similar usefulness to his, at least for me. And I could absolutely see your channel growing as big, if not maybe bigger than his someday. But what's next for Bible Paladin?
Well, I appreciate that, and really, it's a passion of mine, something I'm really enjoying, and hopefully people are getting, something good out of it, which is great. And what's next? I think there's two directions that I've been going, and I've kind of been experimenting with a few things. One is the commentaries, right? It's finished Genesis. I'm going to be doing the book, the Gospel of Matthew next, and kind of going through that, because I think it's a good break from the Old Testament. We're going to get this story about Jesus and who he was, who he is, what that's about, and what that can mean for us today. And I think Mark's Gospel is a great way to kind of jump into the New Testament. It's the shortest Gospel. It's very fast paced. We're going through it. We're getting an idea of who Jesus is and what that looks like. And so I'm going to continue doing the commentaries, kind of the few verses at a time, going through each. Hopefully, who knows how long I'm going to be doing this, but if I can get through each book of the Bible, I think that would be awesome. That'd be a lot of fun.
Oh, that'd be amazing.
In doing that. But the other thing is, I've kind of started another playlist, reading between the lines. I don't know if you've seen any of those videos, in which I kind of just,
of course I have,
different questions, just kind of things. I've kind of been sticking to kind of where I'm at. I've done a few of them, with some of the Old Testament stories. One that I did, which it's just blown me away, because this one video has gotten more videos than all of my other videos combined in terms of views. And I didn't realize it would blow up like this, but I guess the Mandela effect is like really big on YouTube. And
I think it's called like Mandela effects in the Bible, right?
Yes,
or something like that.
Exactly. And I did that one, and that one's just like, it's just blown up with views, which is kind of, it's funny to me, because it's really not even my mainstream. I was just having fun with it, and just, finding things. But I'd like to do a lot more of those types of kind of tangential videos about just things in the Bible, questions that we have. One of the things, and we didn't really touch on, but it's just the humor in the Bible. A lot of people don't realize how many of the stories, there's just such great humor, or things that sometimes we don't get, because it's just, we don't have the context of the language, whether it's in Hebrew or Greek, or the context of sayings that were there or not there. And so it just goes over a lot of our heads so often. But there's just these little comments. I just want to give you one example real quick, because I think it's great.
Oh, please do. I was actually going to ask, so please.
Oh, okay. So in the gospel, and you'll get this because you went through Genesis, and you heard all about Jacob. Okay. So Jesus is calling us disciples, and they're introducing each other to each other. It's, hey, we met this Jesus guy. Come and meet him. Come and see who he is. Do this. And so they bring in Nathaniel, and Jesus sees Nathaniel from afar, and he says, "Oh wow, this." Well, first, okay, I got to scoot back a little bit. First of all, they're telling Nathaniel, "We met this guy named Jesus. He's from Nazareth." And Nathaniel's like, "Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Because Nazareth was this little podunk city, in first century Palestine, and it was like not known for anything. And so then Jesus meets Nathaniel, who just said this, a little while ago to his other apostle. And Jesus says, Nathaniel, you are a true Israelite. There is no deceit in you. Now,
Okay, yeah,
Israel,
right.
is Jacob's name. Jacob became Israel. He was the most deceitful person in Genesis. I mean, he was like tricking
Yes.
everybody doing this. He was the trickster, and Jesus is basically kind of using a pun on his name and being just complete sarcasm. It's like, oh yeah, there's no deceit in this guy. Now, if you're reading it and you don't have that context, you're thinking, oh, Jesus is giving this guy a compliment. He's saying, oh, he's a true Israelite. There's no guile in him. There's no, this. But Jesus wasn't giving him a compliment. He was basically
Yeah.
saying, I got to watch you.
It's funny.
So little things like that.
One of my favorite little things that made me laugh when I read Genesis, I forget what book it is, but I'm pretty sure that I think God is talking to, or maybe an angel or God is talking to Rebecca, and he says something along the lines of like, you will bear children. And then she laughs and he says,
Oh yeah.
why did you laugh? And she says, I didn't laugh. And he says, no, but you did.
Right.
And like, for me, that is hilarious. Like, why would you tell God? Why would you lie to God? And he's like, why'd you laugh? She's like, I didn't. He's like, no, you did. Like, there's just little moments like that actually are funny.
Yeah, it's great.
And it doesn't have to be like this,
yeah.
or sorry, not Rebecca, with Sarah. And it doesn't have to be this like extremely serious, daunting thing to read at all times.
Right.
I mean, there are elements of it that are very serious, but some that are much more lighthearted and actually a fun read.
Oh yeah. And I think the more, you do get into it and you study it, and I've studied a lot of the biblical languages and kind of, trying to figure out the context of that is just to be able to see, some of that humor and some of, that is, yeah, there are parts of it, like you said, that are very serious, and things that's like, oh my gosh, this is what it's about. But on the other hand, there's like, yeah, God's just kind of having fun, and I think that says something to us too. It is not to take ourselves so seriously sometimes. Because, sometimes, like I say, I see some of these other debates and some of these, things that have been done, in the name of religion or this or that. It's just like, oh my gosh, I don't think that's what it's about. I think there's something that it could be a guide for our lives, but also kind of God saying, hey guys, don't take yourself so seriously.
Completely. And I think the more we bicker over what is right and what is wrong, the further we stray from what the message of faith really is.
Yeah.
Well, look, Mark, I just wanted to thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, not only for this interview, but for helping guide the beginning steps of my walk in faith. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thanks for having me, and keep doing what you're doing, because, I think we're all doing this work, God's work, in different ways. And so I appreciate it.